Hello, welcome back to our study in Genesis. I hope that you're having a great time continuing to read through this marvelous first book in the Bible. And now we are coming towards the last dramatic conclusion to the book of Genesis, where we begin the reunion of Joseph with his family. And we're in chapter 42, just going to kind of overview what's going on here and maybe some ways that we can think about it. The famine now has set in that was predicted by Pharaoh's dreams, and Joseph interpreted those, you remember. And now the family of Jacob, back in Canaan, in the area of Beersheba, about 175 miles away from where Joseph is now out of food. They're becoming desperate, and they need to go and find food. Jacob tells his sons, hey, there's food in Egypt. I need you guys to go. So he sends 10 of his sons. He has 11, but he's going to keep Benjamin at home. Now, just kind of catch up where we are in the story. Joseph was 17 years old when his brothers conspired against him and ended up selling him as a slave into Egypt. Joseph is around 30 years old or so when he's out of prison. And now it's 7 years later, at least, when the famine is now starting. So he's somewhere in that range of 37, 38, 39, maybe 40 years old. He's somewhere in that range. So he's no longer a young man. He's really a middle-aged man, which means that some of his older brothers are certainly maybe approaching what we call a senior adult age. So if you have an image of all of these young guys, they're not young. These are grown men, some even older men, who are now going to be reunited. But the brothers come down to Egypt, and they meet unknowingly, unwittingly. They meet up with Joseph. He recognizes them, but they don't recognize him, and that makes perfect sense because, first of all, it's been 20 years since they've seen him. Joseph is speaking in Egyptian. He looks like an Egyptian, and he is the last person in the world they expect to be in that position, second only to Pharaoh with this much power. So you often don't see what you're not looking for. So they're not looking to see Joseph there. So all of those factors is perfectly believable that they would not recognize Joseph. But he easily recognizes them. And there's some irony going on here because Joseph begins to quiz his brothers. He knows who they are, they don't know him. He begins to accuse them of some things, of being spies and things like this. It was just kind of ridiculous. And the brothers are defending themselves. And ironically, they say, no, we're honest men. We're telling you the truth. But the fact is they're not honest men. That's being revealed. And they've been keeping a family secret and a lie alive for all of these years, for 20 years. And so you need to see what's going on here. This is the beginning of a road to restoration, a road of repentance for these brothers. And so Joseph begins to play with these guys, and then we're going to talk more about this. And so he's accusing them of being spies. The text says he's treating and speaking to them roughly on purpose. And one might think, well, he's kind of enjoying this. And maybe he was a little bit, but we're going to see that's really not what he's doing. He threatens to throw them all into prison. He does put them all in prison for 3 days. He says at first, I'm going to keep all of you here until one of you goes back and fetches your younger brother so I know you're telling the truth. But then he changes his mind. He says, well, I'll just keep one of you here, which ends up being Simeon. And he says, the rest of you go back, but don't you come back again unless you bring your younger brother. Then I'll know you're telling the truth. So the brothers return home with the food. Joseph supplies them with the food they came to get. And he also sneaks into their bags the money they had brought to pay for the food. So once they discover that, they begin to despair even more, thinking, well, now he's going to think we're thieves and liars. But they get back home. Now, remember, this is not a short process. It's about 175 miles. This is easily a 2-week trip on foot. So they've probably been gone for over a month, easily. So they get back home to their father. They recall the whole story of what happened there with this prince of Egypt. And their father's distraught because the last thing in the world he wants to do is to send Benjamin back. Benjamin, he even says, is my only son, which imagine makes the other 10 feel great, or 9, not Simeon. He's not there. But he says, if I were to lose Benjamin, I would die myself. I can't even think of losing him or risking him. And we see that Jacob is continuing to demonstrate the favoritism that has caused so much dysfunction in his family from the very beginning. You go all the way back to the story of Leah and Rachel. That's the heart of where this favoritism is coming from, because he never wanted Leah to start with. His heart was given to Rachel, and now he has only given his heart to the sons of Rachel, Joseph and Benjamin, which certainly helps explain, not excuse, but explain so much of the bad behavior that we see from the other sons. And even Reuben demonstrates some folly here, and I see it almost as a desperation to win his father's favor. He says, I will do this. I will take care of Benjamin. If he doesn't come back, you can kill my 2 sons. Well, that's crazy. Kill my 2 sons? This is the desperation that's within this family and the dysfunction that exists, that even something like that would be said or even entertained. So now you've got the sons back in Beersheba in Canaan with some food for a while. They're going to have to go back. Simeon is in prison, being held hostage basically by Joseph. And we see the plan beginning to unfold. So the bigger question is, how do we understand the story theologically, and what do we learn from it? Well, we see that what's beginning to happen is the pieces are beginning to come together to explain why God has allowed Joseph to go through all of these trials of being thrown in a pit and abandoned by his brothers, and told his father that he'd been killed, and then now it was in prison, and God maneuvered him exactly to the right place for this moment to encounter his brothers and his family, so ultimately he could rescue them. But we see Joseph being used by God as an agent for healing for his family. He's got a dysfunctional, lying, unloving, unrepentant bunch of brothers that God is going to use Joseph to help bring restoration to that family. And even bigger than that, God is using Joseph to preserve the family of Jacob, the family of Israel, who are going to become a large people group, who's going to be the people of God, through which so much is going to happen. The law will come to these people. Ultimately, through these people and their preservation, Messiah is going to come. Jesus is going to come. So we always have to see this in the bigger picture. And then even beyond just what God is doing and what we learn about God and his plan, we see the examples of the characters in these narratives, and we can learn from them. And we sometimes we learn good things, sometimes we learn bad things. But in the brothers, we see a lot of fear and pride and hard-heartedness. Even when they go back from this difficult thing they had down in Egypt, and this fear, and they still are not going to confess to their dad what they did. They're still going to keep the secret, the family secret, and this lie about Joseph up. And that's at the very heart of what's going on. They won't confess. They're willing to let Simeon rot in an Egyptian prison rather than tell the truth and come clean. And it's only by necessity that they're being forced to ultimately admit what they've done and get to a place of repentance. In Jacob, we just find ourselves constantly just shaking our head at how pathetic he is with this favoritism toward the sons of Rachel, and how he's so dismissive with his other sons. And he too is willing to let one of his older sons, Simeon, just stay there in prison in Egypt rather than risk Benjamin to go get Simeon out of jail. And with Joseph, though, we get a good example. And here's what I mean. Joseph is a human being just like any one of us. And you might think at first, well, Joseph's being kind of mean and manipulative and all of this. But think about it. If you were in his shoes, you have essentially ultimate power. I mean, you have the power of life and death. He only answers to Pharaoh. You're in an ancient culture Where if Joseph had wanted to commit all of his brothers to jail, if he had wanted to execute them, he certainly had the power to do so. If Joseph was about getting back at them and having revenge, he could have done so. But that's not what he's doing. He probably is feeling those emotions. I'm sure it's a mixture of gratitude in seeing them, but also anger about what they've done to him, and some resentments and bitterness, but he's not letting that overcome him. Every step that he's going to take is going to be a plan of restoration, not revenge. It's one that we see being redemptive, and we see God using Joseph to accomplish this. And we find out at the end that Joseph does see these things spiritually and clearly. And I think that's a great word to us, because when hardship comes or difficult things come, or especially when people treat us badly, we do have a choice like Joseph. We could seek revenge, we could become bitter, we could be angry, or we could do whatever we can do to restore, to be redemptive in any situation to the best of our ability. It's a marvelous story. And now the story doesn't end here, because the brothers are going to have to come back, and that's what happens in chapter 43. So continue to read, and we'll be right back up here. We'll pick up with chapter 43 and see what happens next when the brothers have to return.